In the autumn of 1968, a man who had once been written off as a political relic stood before the American people and made a promise. Richard Nixon, seeking the presidency after years in the wilderness, spoke often of Vietnam. He spoke of ending the war. He spoke of bringing American soldiers home. And he used a phrase that would come to define his approach in the years ahead. He promised peace with honor. Nixon's campaign rhetoric was carefully calibrated. He criticized the Johnson administration's handling of the conflict, suggesting that years of escalation had produced only stalemate and suffering. Yet he declined to offer specific details about how he would change course. He spoke in generalities, allowing voters to project their hopes onto his words. What he made clear was this: he would not accept a rapid, unconditional withdrawal that might be perceived as defeat. The war would end, but it would end on terms that preserved American credibility. On the 5th of November 1968, Nixon won the presidential election. He inherited a war that had already claimed tens of thousands of American lives and showed no signs of resolution. Approximately 540,000 United States troops were deployed in South Vietnam when he took office. The burden of that commitment weighed heavily on the nation, and Nixon understood that the political clock was ticking. Among his first decisions was the selection of advisors who would shape Vietnam policy. Henry Kissinger was appointed Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, and he quickly became Nixon's principal counselor on the war. Kissinger brought an academic background in international relations and a conviction that diplomacy and military pressure must work in tandem. Melvin Laird, the new Secretary of Defense, was another crucial figure. Laird had argued even before joining the cabinet that the United States should train and equip South Vietnamese forces to assume the main burden of the fighting. William Rogers served as Secretary of State, though he would play a less central role in day-to-day Vietnam strategy than Kissinger. In Saigon, Ellsworth Bunker remained as ambassador, providing regular assessments of the South Vietnamese government and the capabilities of its armed forces. Shortly after taking office in January 1969, Nixon directed Kissinger to conduct a thorough review of Vietnam policy. This was done through a new mechanism called the National Security Study Memorandum process. The first such memorandum, known as NSSM-1, instructed government agencies to reassess the military and political situation in Vietnam and to outline options for American policy going forward. The resulting study was extensive, compiling more than 500 pages of analysis. It summarized existing strategies, examined force levels, and explored possible negotiation and withdrawal scenarios. The document reflected a sober recognition that there were no easy answers. Nixon's early private discussions with his advisors in 1969 focused on combining military pressure with negotiations. The goal was to induce concessions from North Vietnam through a mixture of demonstrated resolve and diplomatic engagement. At the same time, the administration sought to open or expand secret channels for talks with Hanoi, complementing the ongoing public negotiations in Paris that had begun under President Johnson. Nixon and Kissinger believed that progress might come more readily through private diplomacy than through the formal sessions that attracted so much public attention. The administration framed its Vietnam policy around three main tracks. The first was Vietnamization, a term that would soon become central to the American approach. The second was negotiation, the pursuit of a diplomatic settlement that could bring the war to an acceptable conclusion. The third was the maintenance of sufficient military pressure to convince North Vietnam that continued fighting would be costly. These three elements were meant to reinforce one another, creating conditions under which Hanoi might finally agree to terms. The concept of Vietnamization was not entirely new. but it received new emphasis and a new name under Nixon. Melvin Laird is widely credited with popularizing the term in early 1969. He preferred it to alternatives like de-Americanization or withdrawal, which carried connotations of retreat. The basic idea was straightforward. Strengthen the Army of the Republic of Vietnam so that American ground forces could be reduced without abandoning the South Vietnamese government. Nixon and Laird argued internally that a sudden total withdrawal could undermine American credibility and abandon a treaty ally. The transition had to be gradual and tied to demonstrable progress. In March 1969, Laird visited South Vietnam to assess the capabilities of South Vietnamese forces and to recommend how Vietnamization could be implemented. He returned with an optimistic assessment, reinforcing his support for the policy. Following his trip, Nixon ordered a substantial increase in training, equipment, and modernization programs for the South Vietnamese military. The goal was to build an army capable of defending its country with reduced American participation. Nixon's first formal announcement of troop withdrawals came on the 8th of June, 1969. He stated that 25,000 American troops would be withdrawn by the end of August. It was a modest beginning, but it signaled that the policy of Vietnamization was moving from concept to reality. By the end of 1969, American troop strength in Vietnam had been reduced from about 540,000 to roughly 475,000 personnel. The withdrawals would continue in the months and years ahead. On the 3rd of November, 1969, Nixon delivered a nationally televised address that would become one of the most significant speeches of his presidency. He publicly introduced the term Vietnamization and explained his strategy to the American people. He described two broad choices: immediate withdrawal, which he rejected, or a continued effort to seek what he called a just peace through negotiation and the strengthening of South Vietnamese forces. In that speech, Nixon appealed to what he called the silent majority of Americans. He defined this group as citizens who did not join anti-war demonstrations, but who, he argued, still favored a responsible and orderly end to American involvement. It was a rhetorical stroke aimed at isolating the more vocal critics of the war. Nixon presented his goal as ending American involvement in a manner that would preserve peace with honor for both the United States and its allies. He emphasized that the United States sought no military victory over North Vietnam, but wanted a negotiated settlement respecting South Vietnam's independence. All American forces would ultimately be withdrawn on a schedule linked to the growing capability of South Vietnamese forces. Privately, Nixon and Kissinger explored concepts of increased pressure to influence Hanoi's negotiating stance. Internal studies examined various options, from accelerated withdrawal to more intense military pressure. Nixon leaned toward a combination of Vietnamization and selective increases in military action. In July 1969, Nixon visited South Vietnam and met with President Nguyen Van Thieu in Saigon. The two leaders discussed Vietnamization and negotiation strategies. Nixon briefed Thieu on American domestic attitudes and the need to move ahead on multiple fronts, including military strengthening and pacification programs. He assured the South Vietnamese president that the United States would not impose a settlement that undermined South Vietnam's sovereignty. It was a delicate balance, maintaining the confidence of an ally while preparing the American public for a gradual departure. Throughout 1969, Nixon publicly rejected an immediate, unconditional pullout from Vietnam, arguing that such a course would endanger American global credibility. At the same time, he repeatedly affirmed that his administration's goal was the complete withdrawal of American combat forces on an agreed timetable. The strategy combined a rhetorical commitment to peace with honor, a practical program of Vietnamization and phased withdrawals, and a continuing effort to pressure North Vietnam through military and diplomatic means. It was a policy born of constraint, shaped by the realities Nixon inherited and the promises he had made. The administration's messaging argued that, after the Tet Offensive, the American objective was no longer to win a decisive military victory, but to secure a stable, non-communist South Vietnam through negotiations and the gradual transfer of responsibility. Nixon maintained many bombing restrictions on North Vietnam while focusing American air power on interdiction in Laos and support within South Vietnam. Internal documents from this period show that Nixon and Kissinger linked progress in troop withdrawals to both battlefield conditions and the pace of negotiations. The policy of Vietnamization was introduced as a means of reducing American casualties and domestic opposition while preserving commitments to South Vietnam. It was a strategy designed to buy time and shift the burden of fighting to those whose country was most directly at stake. Whether it could succeed remained to be seen. But as 1969 drew to a close, the machinery was in motion. American troops were beginning to come home, South Vietnamese forces were being expanded, and in Paris, diplomats continued their slow work, searching for a peace that remained elusive. The word Vietnamization entered the American political vocabulary in 1969. And it would remain there for years to come. It was more than a policy. It was a promise, a plan, and a gamble all at once. At its core, Vietnamization meant expanding, equipping, and training South Vietnamese forces while reducing the American combat role. The idea was not entirely new, but under the Nixon administration, it received a new name, a new urgency, and a new prominence in the national conversation about the war. Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird is widely credited with popularizing the term. He preferred it to alternatives like de-Americanization or withdrawal, words that carried connotations of retreat and defeat. Vietnamization sounded more constructive, more forward-looking. It suggested a transition rather than an abandonment. Laird had argued even before joining the cabinet that the United States should train and equip South Vietnamese forces to assume the main burden of the war. When he took office, he set about turning that conviction into operational reality. In March 1969, Laird returned from a visit to South Vietnam with an optimistic assessment of the potential of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. He believed that with proper support, South Vietnamese forces could take on a larger share of the fighting. His report reinforced the administration's commitment to the policy. On the 16th of April 1969, Nixon directed Laird to begin gradually shifting the main burden of the war to South Vietnamese forces. The orders went down the chain of command to General Creighton Abrams, the commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam. Abrams was instructed to support the enlargement, improvement, and modernization of the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces as quickly as possible. Laird ordered the Military Assistance Command to prepare 2 withdrawal contingency plans. One assumed continued American participation alongside South Vietnamese forces. The other anticipated a fully self-sufficient South Vietnamese military after complete Vietnamization. Both plans required careful calibration of troop levels, training programs, and equipment deliveries. The challenge was immense. Vietnamization was closely linked to the broader Nixon doctrine, which in Asia emphasized that allies should provide their own manpower while the United States supplied support and equipment. This represented a shift from the earlier approach of direct American combat involvement to a model of assistance and advisory support. The policy aimed to reduce American casualties and domestic opposition by decreasing the American troop presence without immediately abandoning South Vietnam to its enemies. Internal documents defined Vietnamization as transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while maintaining American air, naval, logistical, and advisory support. It required significant increases in funding for training, equipment, and modernization programs for the South Vietnamese military. The policy was not simply about withdrawal. It was about building a military capable of standing on its own, or at least standing with less direct American assistance. Early planning envisaged phased American withdrawals tied to measurable improvements in South Vietnamese forces rather than fixed dates alone. Criteria used to judge readiness for further withdrawals included unit strength, leadership quality, performance in operations, and progress in pacification efforts across the countryside. These were subjective measures in many respects, open to interpretation and debate, but they provided a framework for decision-making. Nixon's nationally televised address on the 3rd of November 1969 publicly outlined Vietnamization as a central pillar of his Vietnam strategy. In that speech, he stated that the primary mission of American troops had been changed so that their main role was to enable South Vietnamese forces to assume full responsibility for security. He told the nation that after Laird's March visit, he had ordered a substantial increase in the training and equipment of South Vietnamese forces. He noted that American air operations in Vietnam had been reduced by more than 20% as part of the new policy framework. Nixon described Vietnamization as a plan developed in cooperation with the South Vietnamese for the complete withdrawal of American ground combat forces on an orderly timetable. He emphasized that withdrawals would be made from strength and not from weakness, with the pace tied to growth in South Vietnamese capability. This was a crucial distinction. Nixon wanted to demonstrate that America was leaving on its own terms, not being driven out. The president reiterated that Vietnamization preserved the principle that the people of South Vietnam should determine their own future. He framed the policy as one of two paths: a negotiated settlement, if possible, or continued implementation of Vietnamization if negotiations failed. Either way, the goal was the same. American involvement would end, but South Vietnam would have a fighting chance to survive. Laird presented Vietnamization publicly as enabling South Vietnam to fight its own war. It was a signal that the era of large American ground operations was drawing to a close. A February 1970 report to Congress officially linked the Nixon Doctrine to Vietnamization as the concrete form of this approach in Southeast Asia. The connection was explicit. America would help its allies help themselves. Vietnamization also aimed to enhance the political legitimacy of the Saigon regime by making its forces visibly responsible for fighting. If South Vietnamese soldiers were doing the bulk of the combat, the argument went: the government in Saigon could claim a more authentic nationalist mantle. The policy served multiple purposes simultaneously. Troop withdrawals announced in mid-1969 and 1970 were explicitly presented as results of progress in Vietnamizing the war. Nixon's announcements cited improved performance and training of South Vietnamese forces as justification for each increment of American troop reduction. The message was consistent. Vietnamization was working, and America could afford to bring more soldiers home. In his April 1970 address on progress toward peace in Vietnam, Nixon again described Vietnamization as one of two fronts in the effort to end the war. The first was negotiation. The second, if negotiations failed, was ending the war through Vietnamization. He reaffirmed a plan for complete withdrawal of all American combat troops and eventually other forces, with replacement by South Vietnamese units on a scheduled timetable. He reiterated that anything was negotiable except the right of the South Vietnamese people to determine their own political future. Official messaging stressed that American withdrawals were conditional. They could be slowed or reversed if enemy activity significantly increased. This caveat was important. It preserved flexibility for the administration and signaled to Hanoi that America was not simply walking away regardless of circumstances. Vietnamization planning assumed continued American provision of air power and logistics even as ground combat forces decreased. The South Vietnamese military would take over the ground war, but American planes would continue to fly. American advisors would continue to train and guide, and American supply lines would continue to deliver the materiel of war. The transition was partial, not complete. Force expansion under Vietnamization aimed to increase South Vietnamese ground, naval, and air units to fill gaps left by departing American formations. Training programs focused on improving leadership, combined arms coordination, and the capacity for independent operations. The policy explicitly extended to territorial forces, including regional and popular forces, which were to assume more local security responsibilities in villages and hamlets across the country. Some American planners hoped that successful Vietnamization would allow significant troop reductions by 1972 while preserving the Saigon government. It was an ambitious timeline, and not everyone believed it could be met. Allied public reactions were mixed. Some American supporters welcomed the prospect of fewer casualties. Critics worried that the policy amounted to abandoning South Vietnam to an uncertain fate. South Vietnamese leaders publicly endorsed Vietnamization, but privately they expressed concerns about the pace and reliability of American support. They understood that their survival depended on continued American assistance, and they watched the troop withdrawals with a mixture of hope and anxiety. A Kissinger memo, issued at Nixon's direction, instructed agencies to develop a specific timetable for Vietnamizing the war. The machinery of government was set in motion. Nixon and Laird consistently rejected using the term withdrawal regardless of conditions. They insisted that withdrawals would be linked to South Vietnamese readiness. The distinction mattered to them. By the end of 1970, Vietnamization had become the dominant label for American strategy in Vietnam, used in official speeches, media coverage, and discussions among allies. Early commentary debated whether the South Vietnamese military could realistically reach the level of capability envisioned in official plans. Skeptics pointed to weaknesses in leadership and logistics. Supporters cited improvements in training and morale. The debate would continue as the war itself continued. The success or failure of Vietnamization would shape the legacy of American involvement in Southeast Asia and the lives of millions who waited to see what peace, if any, would finally come. The numbers told a story of transformation. In April 1969, American troop strength in Vietnam reached its peak at approximately 543,000 personnel. It was the high watermark of direct American military involvement in the conflict. From that point forward, the tide would begin to recede. The policy of Vietnamization had set in motion a gradual but unmistakable shift in the balance of forces. At the end of 1968, American troop levels in Vietnam stood at approximately 536,000. The first significant reduction came with Nixon's announcement on the 8th of June 1969 that 25,000 troops would be withdrawn by the end of August. It was a modest beginning, but it signaled intent. By the end of 1969, American strength had been reduced to about 475,000 troops. The pace of withdrawal would accelerate in the years ahead. By the end of 1970, American troop levels had fallen to roughly 334,000. By December of 1971, the number had dropped further to about 156,000 personnel. The drawdown was substantial and sustained. Over the course of 2.5 years, nearly 400,000 American soldiers had come home from Vietnam. Nixon's guidance in April 1969 tied withdrawal decisions to progress in strengthening South Vietnamese forces and to the overall security situation. The withdrawals were not meant to be automatic or predetermined. They were conditional, calibrated to circumstances on the ground. This gave the administration flexibility, but it also created uncertainty. Each withdrawal announcement was presented as evidence of progress, but the war itself continued. As American forces drew down, South Vietnamese forces expanded. Estimates place South Vietnamese armed forces at about 897,000 personnel in 1969. By 1970, that number had increased to roughly 968,000. Planning documents projected that the total would surpass 1 million as Vietnamization progressed. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam alone was slated to grow to over 500,000 men in the early 1970s. The expansion was ambitious and demanding. Vietnamization involved expanding every branch of the South Vietnamese military. Infantry, armor, artillery, airborne, ranger, and territorial units all grew in size and capability. The Military Assistance Command in Vietnam and the Pacific Command established force goals for divisions and separate brigades to ensure adequate coverage across all 4 core tactical zones. It was a massive organizational effort. The advisory structure remained in place throughout this period, though its focus shifted. American advisors transitioned from primarily supporting combat operations to emphasizing training and evaluation of South Vietnamese units. They employed various metrics to assess readiness, including combat effectiveness ratings and performance in joint operations. Indicators such as battalion-level operations conducted, reaction times, and casualty ratios were used to gauge progress. The numbers were scrutinized and debated. American troop reductions were typically announced in phased increments, each linked to targets for additional South Vietnamese units to assume primary responsibilities. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam's role in planning and executing operations increased as American units shifted from leading to supporting roles in many areas. The transition was gradual but unmistakable. In the northern regions of South Vietnam, designated as I Corps and II Corps, South Vietnamese forces gradually took over more static defense and pacification tasks, while American units initially focused on mobile operations before withdrawing. Regional and popular forces, the territorial components of the South Vietnamese military, were expanded and upgraded to handle local security and village defense. These forces were often the first line of protection for rural communities. Training programs under Vietnamization emphasized leadership development for officers and non-commissioned officers to support independent command of larger formations. Advisory teams at division, regiment, and battalion level provided instruction in tactics, logistics, and staff planning to their South Vietnamese counterparts. The goal was to build an officer corps capable of leading without constant American guidance. Vietnamization saw a shift in American emphasis from search and destroy missions toward supportive operations led by South Vietnamese forces. Clear and hold and pacification operations became more prominent. The idea was to secure territory and population rather than simply to pursue and engage enemy forces in the field. It was a different kind of war, or at least a different phase of the same war. While ground troops drew down, American air power remained significant in supporting South Vietnamese operations through 1971 and beyond. Tactical aircraft and strategic bombers continued to fly missions in support of ground forces. The South Vietnamese military received increased numbers of modern small arms, including M16 rifles, replacing older American and French pattern weapons. Artillery pieces and mortars were delivered to enable more organic fire support at division and corps levels. By 1970 and 1971, South Vietnamese forces had acquired substantial numbers of American armored vehicles, including M48 tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers. The transfer of helicopter assets, such as UH-1 utility helicopters, to the South Vietnamese Air Force supported mobility and medical evacuation. Fixed-wing aircraft, including A-37 light attack aircraft and some F-5 fighters, were also transferred to South Vietnamese control. The modernization was extensive. American logistical support remained crucial throughout this period. The South Vietnamese military continued to rely on American supply systems, maintenance facilities, and spare parts for much of its new equipment. Official assessments cited the number of units rated combat ready as a key benchmark for authorizing further American withdrawals. The Joint Chiefs and Military Assistance Command monitored performance in large joint operations as tests of whether Vietnamization was working. Command histories from 1969 and 1970 noted improvements in South Vietnamese operations in some regions while questioning performance in others. The picture was mixed. South Vietnamese forces assumed control of additional sectors of the demilitarized zone and key highways as American Marine and Army units redeployed. By late 1971, South Vietnamese units were conducting most ground operations in many provinces, with American units increasingly limited to support and specialized roles. The conduct of operations was increasingly turned over to South Vietnamese forces during the summer and fall of 1969. Troop reduction announcements in 1970 and 1971 were presented as evidence that Vietnamization was proceeding on schedule. Yet some American evaluations expressed concern that South Vietnamese forces still depended heavily on American air and artillery support. The question was whether they could stand on their own when that support was reduced or withdrawn. Joint Chiefs' histories later summarized that experiences such as the 1971 Laos Incursion raised doubts about the depth of South Vietnamese capabilities despite prior expansion. Nonetheless, official American narratives during this period portrayed Vietnamization and the growth of South Vietnamese forces as key successes that enabled substantial troop reductions. Decision-makers used troop figures, force strength data, and readiness ratings as quantitative indicators to justify policy statements about progress. By the end of 1971, the numerical balance in South Vietnam had shifted dramatically. The large American ground presence that had characterized the late 1960s had given way to a predominantly South Vietnamese ground force structure. American troop levels had declined from over 540,000 to under 200,000. South Vietnamese numbers had grown correspondingly. The overall trajectory of the 1969 to 1971 period showed a coordinated process of American withdrawal and South Vietnamese expansion. Whether that expansion translated into genuine military capability remained the central question of the war. The transition was not merely a matter of numbers. It involved changes in culture, in command relationships, and in the very nature of the conflict. American soldiers who had once led patrols now found themselves in advisory roles. South Vietnamese officers who had once deferred to their American counterparts now bore the weight of command. The shift was psychological as much as organizational. For the soldiers on both sides, the statistics meant something concrete. American families waited for their sons and husbands and brothers to come home. South Vietnamese families watched their own men go off to a war that had no end in sight. The troop tables that filled military reports represented human lives, human choices, human fates. Behind every number was a story waiting to be told. And the story of Vietnamization was still being written, its conclusion unknown, its outcome dependent on battles yet to be fought and decisions yet to be made. The numbers told one story. The war would tell another, and that story was far from finished. While the public debate over Vietnamization proceeded in full view of the American people, another war was being conducted in secrecy. It was a war fought from the skies over Cambodia, a country that was officially neutral, a country where the presence of American bombs would have appeared as a dramatic escalation of the conflict. And yet the bombs fell night after night for more than a year before the American public learned of their existence. Operation Menu was a covert, strategic air command bombing campaign in eastern Cambodia conducted from the 18th of March 1969 to the 26th of May 1970. Its targets were the base areas and sanctuaries that North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces had established just inside Cambodian territory. American planners believed that these sanctuaries supported infiltration, resupply, training, and rest for communist forces operating in South Vietnam. As long as they remained intact, the enemy would have safe havens from which to launch attacks and to which they could retreat. President Nixon authorized the first series of B-52 strikes after internal debate about expanding the war into Cambodia. The initial strike, codenamed Breakfast, was carried out on the 18th of March 1969 against a location designated Base Area 353 near the Cambodian-South Vietnamese border. The bombers flew through the night, guided by radar from facilities in South Vietnam. When they returned to base, the targets they had hit were officially recorded as locations inside South Vietnam. The deception had begun. Subsequent strike series were given code names that continued the culinary theme: lunch, snack, dinner, supper, and dessert. Each designated different sanctuary areas along the border. The bombing was kept secret in part because Cambodia was officially neutral, and public confirmation of American attacks would have appeared as a war escalation that the administration wished to avoid. Nixon insisted on very tight security around the Cambodia strikes, limiting knowledge to a small circle of White House, Pentagon, and command officials. The operational procedures were designed to maintain the secrecy. B-52s filed flight plans as if they were bombing targets in South Vietnam while actually releasing their payloads over Cambodian sanctuaries. The Air Force used a dual bookkeeping system in which official strike records showed South Vietnamese targets while separate channels tracked the real Cambodian target data. Records of the actual strike coordinates were kept in highly restricted files. The standard reports that went through normal channels listed only the cover targets. Some original mission documents were later destroyed as part of the secrecy measures. The main Cambodian sanctuary complexes targeted included areas along the border known by names that reflected their shapes on the map: the Fishhook, the Parrot's Beak, and other base zones. American intelligence considered the Central Office for South Vietnam, the communist command structure believed to be located in the Mamote Plantation area, a key target of the Menu strikes. Despite repeated attacks, the command center was never definitively located, captured, or destroyed. Between March 1969 and May 1970, approximately 3,875 B-52 sorties were flown under Operation Menu into Cambodian territory. The scale of the campaign was enormous, yet it remained hidden from the American public and from most members of Congress. Henry Kissinger described the dual reporting practice as a form of double bookkeeping in his memoirs. distinguishing between overt records and covert data. The practice reflected the lengths to which the administration was willing to go to maintain secrecy. The secrecy was not absolute. On the 9th of May 1969, a New York Times reporter named William Beecher published an article revealing that B-52s had been bombing Cambodian targets. His story cited unnamed administration sources. Nixon reacted strongly to the leak and instructed Kissinger to have the FBI investigate to identify the source. The resulting wiretap program monitored the telephones of 13 officials and 4 journalists to trace leaks about the secret Cambodia bombing. Despite the Beecher story, the administration did not officially acknowledge Operation Menu in 1969. The article did not generate immediate, large-scale public controversy. For several years, the campaign remained undisclosed to most members of Congress, as routine reporting did not show B-52 operations in Cambodia. The bombers continued their work in the dark. In addition to B-52s, American tactical aircraft also flew strikes against border areas of Cambodia during this period under separate rules of engagement. The rationale presented within the administration stressed protecting American troops in South Vietnam by attacking cross-border supply and staging areas. Every bomb dropped, every sortie flown, was justified as necessary for the defense of American soldiers. Operation Menu ended on the 26th of May 1970, shortly after the start of open-ground incursions into Cambodia. The transition from covert bombing to overt ground operations marked a new phase in the expansion of the war. On the 30th of April 1970, Nixon announced in a televised address that American and South Vietnamese forces had been ordered into Cambodia. He described the action as a limited incursion aimed at attacking enemy sanctuaries and protecting the American withdrawal. The ground operations focused on base areas in the Fishhook and Parrot's Beak regions, including suspected logistical facilities. Nixon and his advisors linked the incursion to Vietnamization, arguing that eliminating border sanctuaries would give South Vietnamese forces more time to develop. The Cambodian ground operations were public, but the earlier B-52 bombing campaign remained officially unacknowledged. The truth emerged gradually through a combination of investigative journalism and congressional inquiry. In December 1972, an Air Force major named Hal Knight wrote to Senator William Proxmire expressing concern about the legality and record-keeping procedures of Cambodian bombing missions. Knight's letter triggered renewed Senate Armed Services Committee inquiries into American air operations in Cambodia. When the Defense Department first provided records to the committee, they omitted reference to menu sorties, reflecting the earlier dual reporting practice. But the questions continued. Hearings on the nomination of General George S. Brown as Air Force Chief of Staff in 1973 led to public disclosure of the secret B-52 strikes. Brown acknowledged to the Senate committee that as 7th Air Force Commander, he had been aware of and involved in Operation Menu. On the 16th of July, 1973, Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger publicly confirmed that B-52s had secretly bombed Cambodia in 1969 and 1970. A subsequent Pentagon report to Congress outlined the scope of Operation Menu and stated that special reporting procedures had been authorized at higher levels. Melvin Laird testified that he had approved a separate reporting system but denied authorizing falsification of official records or document destruction. Kissinger told the New York Times that the White House had not ordered falsification of records and called the practice deplorable. General Earl Wheeler, who had served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stated that Nixon had personally demanded the tightest security for menu operations. Wheeler said the military had devised the dual reporting mechanics, but argued there was no intent to deceive, as understood under military law. Congressional commentary during the 1,973 hearings raised concerns about civilian control of the military and the transparency of war-related decision-making. The revelation of the secret Cambodia bombing contributed to public and congressional skepticism about official war reporting. Later analyses summarize Operation Menu as a covert escalation of the air war intended to strike enemy sanctuaries while avoiding overt acknowledgement of Cambodian involvement. The combined effect of secret bombing and the 1970 incursion into Cambodia is commonly cited in histories of the war as part of the widening of the Vietnam conflict into neighboring countries. What had begun as a war in one nation had become a regional conflagration. The bombs that fell in secret over Cambodia in 1969 were part of that expansion, a hidden chapter in a war that would have many more chapters yet to come. The secrecy surrounding Operation Menu raised fundamental questions about the relationship between a government and its people in time of war. When leaders make decisions to expand a conflict without informing the public, what are the implications for democracy itself? When official records are manipulated to conceal military operations, what happens to the trust that holds a nation together? These were not abstract questions. They were questions that would reverberate through American politics for years after the last bomb fell. For the people of Cambodia, the consequences were more immediate and more devastating. Villages that had existed in a precarious neutrality suddenly found themselves under attack from the skies. Farmers who had tried to stay out of the war found the war coming to them. The craters left by B-52 strikes scarred the landscape and the lives of those who survived. The secret war was secret only to those who did not live beneath its shadow. For the Cambodians in the target zones, there was nothing secret about the explosions that shattered their nights and their homes. In March 1970, the political landscape of Cambodia changed with sudden violence. The National Assembly voted to remove Prince Norodom Sihanouk as chief of state, elevating General Lon Nol to effective leadership. The change contributed to American perceptions that communist forces were increasingly threatening the new government. The moment seemed to present both a danger and an opportunity. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces had established long-standing base areas in eastern Cambodia, including the regions known as the Fishhook and the Parrot's Beak. American and South Vietnamese planners viewed these Cambodian sanctuaries as staging areas for attacks into the 3rd and 4th Corps tactical zones in South Vietnam and as key logistical hubs. The sanctuaries had existed for years, but now, with a new and friendly government in Phnom Penh, the possibility of action against them seemed more feasible. On the 22nd of April 1970, Nixon authorized planning for a South Vietnamese incursion into the Parrot's Beak, with American air support as a prelude to wider operations. The Parrot's Beak is a salient of Cambodian territory extending into South Vietnam about 40 miles from Saigon. The Fishhook is a protrusion of Cambodia about 50 miles northwest of the capital. Both had been heavily used by communist units for years. In late April, South Vietnamese units conducted initial cross-border probes into Can Do province and other areas to test defenses and locate bases. Then, on the 30th of April 1970, Nixon announced in a televised address that American and South Vietnamese forces had been ordered into Cambodia. He described the action as a limited incursion aimed at cleaning out enemy sanctuaries along the border. He argued that failure to act would jeopardize American troops and the Vietnamization program. Nixon stated that the objective was not to occupy Cambodia, but to strike supply bases and leave within a limited period. The incursion was explicitly presented as a finite operation, not an open-ended occupation. The president pledged that American ground troops would be out of Cambodia by the 30th of June 1970. It was a promise that would be kept. The Cambodian campaign lasted about 60 to 75 days, depending on the specific operation. The main American and South Vietnamese operations were concentrated in the Fishhook and Parrot's Beak border regions and nearby base areas. American ground participation was conducted largely by forces from the 2nd Field Force Vietnam and elements of the 1st Cavalry Division and 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. South Vietnamese forces participating included units from the 3rd and 4th Corps, such as the 9th Infantry Division, Armored Cavalry Squadrons, and Ranger Groups. The primary operational objective was to conduct search and destroy missions to eliminate communist sanctuaries and supporting logistics infrastructure. Before ground forces entered, American tactical airstrikes were intensified in late April against suspected targets in Cambodian border areas. South Vietnamese ground operations in the Parrot's Beak began in late April, with forces advancing several kilometers into Cambodian territory. American ground forces crossed into Cambodia on the 1st of May, following the earlier South Vietnamese moves. The overall campaign was divided into multiple operations, with only 2 led by American ground forces while the majority were led by South Vietnamese units. American and South Vietnamese units advanced varying distances into Cambodia, in some cases up to about 30 kilometers from the border. The operations targeted base areas thought to be part of the Communist command structure supporting operations in the 3rd and 4th Corps tactical zones. During the campaign, Allied units seized large quantities of enemy weapons, ammunition, vehicles, and supplies in depots and caches. An Army report on the Cambodian Incursion estimated that enough captured weapons were recovered to equip roughly 54 battalions of 450 men each. The assessment stated that captured ammunition amounted to about a year's supply for enemy forces in the region, and rice captured could feed those forces for about 6 months. Reports noted that Allied forces seized nearly 23,000 individual weapons and 2,500 crew-served weapons during the campaign. Additional captured stores included nearly 17 million rounds of small arms ammunition, 70,000 mortar shells, 143,000 rockets, and about 700 tons of rice. Allied forces also captured or destroyed hundreds of vehicles and significant medical and engineering supplies. The Army's official pamphlet on the Cambodian Incursion lists enemy losses as over 11,000 killed during the period, based on body count reports. Allied casualties numbered in the hundreds killed, with several thousand wounded. The numbers reflected the intensity of the fighting, though they were always subject to the uncertainties inherent in wartime reporting. Signal Corps and logistics units supported the incursion by establishing communications and supply lines into Cambodian operating areas from South Vietnam. South Vietnamese units operated effectively in areas such as the Parrot's Beak and the region known as Angel's Wing, according to American observations. The campaign also involved coordination with the newly formed Cambodian government forces in some operations to help defend key locations. South Vietnamese and Cambodian forces retook the town of Kampong Cham in mid-May 1970. Easing immediate pressure on the capital of Phnom Penh. Nixon and American commanders claimed that the incursion had significantly disrupted enemy logistics by driving communist units deeper into Cambodian territory. The goal of buying time for Vietnamization appeared to have been at least partially achieved. Nixon's address emphasized that the incursion was designed to protect American forces in Vietnam while Vietnamization proceeded, not to widen the war indefinitely. American units began pulling back from Cambodian territory in late June. and by early July, most American ground forces had returned to bases in South Vietnam. The pledge to withdraw by the end of June had been honored. Air and artillery strikes continued along border regions after the ground withdrawal to interdict enemy attempts to re-establish sanctuaries. The Cambodian incursion is often referred to in military literature as the Cambodian Campaign of 1970. Army analyses credit the operation with temporarily reducing enemy activity in some parts of the 3rd and 4th Corps by depriving communist units of nearby sanctuaries. Some enemy forces withdrew deeper into Cambodia after the incursion, leading to more dispersed sanctuary patterns beyond the initial target zones. The campaign occurred while American troop levels in Vietnam were being reduced, giving it a dual character of offensive action amid drawdown. The Nixon administration justified the incursion as necessary to protect Vietnamization and American credibility. The Cambodian campaign became the subject of later military case studies on limited war, cross-border operations, and sanctuary targeting. Official documents and histories generally present the 1970 incursion as a finite operation aimed at disrupting enemy logistics and buying time for South Vietnamese development. Immediate military results included substantial materiel captures and claimed enemy losses. Yet the operation did not lead to permanent removal of communist forces from Cambodia. The sanctuaries were disrupted, but not destroyed. The enemy adapted, as it always did, and the consequences of the incursion would ripple outward in ways that no one could fully foresee. Cambodia's neutrality had been definitively ended. The war had spread to another country, and for the Cambodian people, a long nightmare was just beginning. The political reverberations in the United States were immediate and intense. Nixon's announcement of the incursion triggered a wave of protests across the country. College campuses erupted in demonstrations. The expansion of the war into Cambodia, coming after years of promises about winding down American involvement, struck many as a betrayal. The administration had presented Vietnamization as a path toward withdrawal. The Cambodian incursion seemed to point in the opposite direction. For the soldiers who crossed the border, the experience was one of conventional military operations in unfamiliar terrain. They moved through rubber plantations and jungle, searching for the elusive enemy bases they had been told existed. Some found vast caches of weapons and supplies, confirming the intelligence assessments. Others found empty jungle, the enemy having melted away before their arrival. The fog of war was as thick in Cambodia as it had ever been in Vietnam. The incursion demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of American and South Vietnamese military power. They could project force across borders, seize territory, capture supplies, but they could not eliminate an enemy that refused to fight on conventional terms, an enemy that valued survival above all else and was willing to retreat, disperse, and wait. The sanctuaries could be disrupted, but the will to continue fighting could not be bombed or captured. The war went on, as it always had, as it would for years to come. For years, Cambodia had maintained a precarious neutrality under Prince Norodom Sihanouk. The prince had walked a tightrope between the warring parties, allowing communist forces to use Cambodian territory while officially remaining outside the conflict. Prior to March 1970, Sihanouk's government had tolerated the use of sanctuaries and the port of Sihanoukville in exchange for economic arrangements such as rice purchases from Vietnamese communist forces. It was an arrangement born of necessity, a small country seeking survival amid larger powers at war. With Sihanouk's consent in the 1960s, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces had used Cambodian territory as a logistical corridor and safe haven for operations into South Vietnam. The arrangement served Hanoi's strategic needs while providing Cambodia with a measure of protection against being drawn more deeply into the conflict. But by early 1970, nationalist and anti-communist Cambodian politicians were growing restive. General Lon Nol and Prince Sirik Madak opposed Sihanouk's permissive policy toward Vietnamese communist forces on Cambodian soil. In January through March 1970, government-sponsored anti-Vietnamese demonstrations occurred in Phnom Penh and other cities. Protesters targeted North Vietnamese and Viet Cong embassies. On the 11th and 12th of March, demonstrators attacked and sacked the North Vietnamese embassy in Phnom Penh during protests against the Vietnamese presence. The violence was a signal that something fundamental had changed in Cambodian politics. On the 12th of March 1970, Lon Nol's government closed the port of Sihanoukville to communist shipping, ending a key supply route for enemy forces. Simultaneously, Lon Nol issued an ultimatum demanding that all North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces leave Cambodian territory within 48 to 72 hours. The ultimatum was widely seen as impossible to implement given the scale and entrenchment of communist forces inside Cambodia, but it sent a clear message about the new government's intentions. While Sihanouk was abroad in January through March 1970, political allies of Lon Nol and Sirik Matak consolidated control in Phnom Penh. On the 18th of March 1970, the Cambodian National Assembly voted to remove Sihanouk as head of state, effectively endorsing Lon Nol's assumption of executive authority. In October 1970, Lon Nol proclaimed the establishment of the Khmer Republic, formally ending Cambodia's monarchy. The new regime adopted a more openly pro-American and anti-communist orientation than Sihanouk's neutralist stance. After his ouster, Sihanouk traveled to Beijing and aligned himself with North Vietnam and the Cambodian communist movement known as the Khmer Rouge. From exile, he agreed to front a coalition with the Khmer Rouge, giving the communist insurgency a royalist figurehead. The association of Sihanouk's name with the anti-Lon Nol insurgency encouraged many Cambodian peasants loyal to the monarchy to support or tolerate Khmer Rouge forces. It was a fateful alliance, one whose consequences would unfold over the terrible years ahead. North Vietnam responded to the March 1970 coup by increasing direct military support, advice, and supplies to the Khmer Rouge insurgents. At the request of Khmer Rouge leaders, North Vietnamese forces launched offensives inside Cambodia in late March 1970, moving deeper into Cambodian territory. The command elements that had operated from sanctuaries near the Vietnamese border evacuated some base areas in March 1970 to avoid possible encirclement. Lon Nol's government declared a state of emergency and began hastily expanding the Cambodian armed forces, aiming to mobilize tens of thousands of volunteers. The Khmer Republic sought military assistance from both the United States and South Vietnam to counter communist forces. The United States responded by increasing military aid to Cambodia and coordinating with South Vietnam to provide training and equipment to Cambodian forces. American advisors and special operations units participated in training Cambodian forces and preparing them for joint operations along the border. South Vietnam and Cambodia developed closer military cooperation, with South Vietnamese units conducting joint or coordinated operations with Cambodian forces in border provinces. The Cambodian coup had ended Sihanouk's arrangement with Hanoi and significantly altered North Vietnam's freedom of action regarding official Cambodian policy. North Vietnam responded by expanding its logistical system further west, including into northeastern Cambodia and parts of Laos, to compensate for changing conditions near the border. During 1970, communist forces seized the Laotian towns of Atapu and Saravan to widen the Ho Chi Minh Trail corridor and extend supply routes into Cambodia. A new logistical command, the 470th Transportation Group, was created to manage expanded supply operations in Cambodia. The widened supply route through northeastern Cambodia allowed communist forces to move men and materiel to the Mekong River at Stung Treng. In April through June 1970, the American and South Vietnamese Cambodian incursion intersected with Cambodia's domestic conflict. Allied forces struck communist bases while Cambodian government forces fought Khmer Rouge and Vietnamese units. American official reports framed the Cambodian operation as both a response to communist use of sanctuaries and a measure to support the new Khmer Republic. Cambodia's internal instability created opportunities for the Khmer Rouge to expand from a small clandestine group into a broader rural insurgency. By late 1970, the Khmer Rouge had expanded operations across multiple Cambodian provinces, often operating alongside or supported by North Vietnamese units. The growth of Khmer Rouge strength contributed to a multi-sided civil war involving the Khmer Republic, the Khmer Rouge, North Vietnamese forces, and other actors. The upheaval in Cambodia complicated regional security by adding another arena of conflict linked to the Vietnam War. American Air Force and South Vietnamese aircraft extended operations into Cambodia to hit communist sanctuaries and support Cambodian government forces, especially along routes to Phnom Penh. In 1971, communist forces cut the road from Kampong Som to Phnom Penh, tightening pressure on the Khmer Republic's logistics. American intelligence reporting in 1970 and 1971 linked the Cambodian coup and subsequent fighting to broader North Vietnamese strategy in Indochina. Analysts noted that North Vietnam's deepening involvement in Cambodia risked overextension, but also provided new strategic depth for operations in South Vietnam. Regional overviews describe this period as one when the Vietnam War effectively became a more fully regional conflict involving Laos and Cambodia. The upheaval influenced Thai security perceptions, leading Thailand to monitor cross-border insurgent movements and refugee flows closely. Lon Nol's government fostered close ties with South Vietnam and the United States, aligning the Khmer Republic with anti-communist states in the region. The regime's reliance on American and South Vietnamese support increased as the conflict escalated, straining its own limited military and economic resources. The Cambodian coup and subsequent alignment with the United States removed a buffer between Hanoi and Washington, increasing direct confrontation in Indochina. Communist use of Cambodian sanctuaries and attacks launched from them were cited by American leaders as partial justification for continued operations despite troop withdrawals from South Vietnam. Contemporary analyses emphasized that events in Cambodia complicated efforts to achieve a negotiated settlement by adding new political and military variables. Reports to American policymakers repeatedly described Cambodia's instability as both a threat to regional balance and an opportunity for communist expansion. Some assessments warned that without sustained external support, the Khmer Republic might not be able to withstand Khmer Rouge and North Vietnamese pressure. The shift from Sihanouk's neutrality to Lon Nol's alignment caused a significant deterioration in relations between Cambodia and North Vietnam. By the end of 1971, Cambodia was fully involved in a civil war closely intertwined with the Vietnam War. Multiple foreign forces and interests operated on its territory. The small kingdom that had tried to stay out of the conflict now found itself consumed by it. And the forces unleashed in 1970 would continue their deadly work for years to come, until Cambodia had been transformed beyond recognition. The story of Cambodia's fall from neutrality to civil war illustrates how the Vietnam conflict spread beyond its original boundaries. What began as an intervention to stop communist expansion in one country had become a regional conflagration touching multiple nations. Laos and Cambodia, which had hoped to remain outside the fighting, found themselves drawn inexorably into the vortex. Their peoples, who had no stake in the ideological struggles of the great powers, paid the price nonetheless. For the villagers of eastern Cambodia, the years after 1970 brought suffering on a scale they could scarcely have imagined. They found themselves caught between armies, between ideologies, between forces they could neither control nor escape. The rice paddies that had sustained generations became battlefields. The temples that had stood for centuries became targets, and the peace that Sihanouk had tried to preserve, however imperfectly, gave way to a violence that would consume the entire nation. The war had come to Cambodia, and it would not soon depart. In early 1971, the policy of Vietnamization faced its most significant test. The operation was called Lam Son 719, and it would send South Vietnamese ground forces into Laos to attack the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the logistical lifeline that sustained communist operations in the South. It was the largest and most important test of whether the Army of the Republic of Vietnam could conduct high-intensity operations without American ground troops fighting alongside them. The answer would have profound implications for the future of the war. Operation Lam Son 719 was conducted from early February to late March 1971, with American forces providing air and logistical support, but no ground troops crossing the Laotian border. The operation's stated objective was to disrupt North Vietnamese logistical routes on the Ho Chi Minh Trail by attacking Base Area 604 near the town of Chepon in Laos. American planners identified Chepon, located about 22 miles inside Laos, as a key supply and communications hub for enemy forces. The strategic rationale was to preempt a potential North Vietnamese offensive in 1972 by damaging supply stockpiles and infrastructure in Laos during 1971. If the logistical system could be disrupted, the thinking went, the enemy would be unable to mount major attacks the following year. The operation's name referenced the birthplace of Vietnamese hero Le Loi, while the number 719 referred to Route 9 and the year 1971. It was a name meant to evoke national pride and determination. American ground forces were restricted to operations on the South Vietnamese side of the border, mainly around Khe Sanh and along Route 9. The supporting American operation was called Operation Dewey Canyon 2. General Creighton Abrams, the American commander in Vietnam, oversaw American support but could not command South Vietnamese forces directly in Laotian territory. The South Vietnamese I Corps commander, Lieutenant General Hoang Xuan Lam, was given overall command of Lam Son 719. North Vietnamese strength in and around Base Area 604 was estimated by American intelligence at about 22,000 in early 1971, including logistics troops and Pathet Lao units. The North Vietnamese had organized their forces under the newly created B-70 Corps, which controlled several divisions and support units. It was a formidable concentration of enemy power. The offensive plan called for South Vietnamese armored and airborne forces to advance west along Route 9 from Khe Sanh toward Chepon. Supporting units, including Rangers and infantry, were to establish fire bases north and south of Route 9 to protect the flanks of the advance. A Marine brigade was held in reserve near Khe Sanh to respond to contingencies or reinforce threatened sectors. Phase 1 began with American operations to reopen Route 9 and secure Khe Sanh as a forward support base. These preliminary operations started around the 30th of January 1971 and involved elements of the 1st Brigade, 5th Infantry Division, and 1st Brigade, 1st Cavalry Division. Following preliminary artillery and B-52 strikes, South Vietnamese ground elements began crossing into Laos on the 8th of February 1971. The initial South Vietnamese Armor Infantry Task Force included the 1st Armored Brigade and elements of the 1st and 8th Airborne Battalions totaling about 4,000 troops. Estimates placed the total South Vietnamese force committed to Lam Son 719 at between 17,000 and 20,000 troops, organized in about 42 battalion-size units. Major formations involved included the Airborne Division, 1st Infantry Division, Marine Division elements, the 1st Armored Brigade, Ranger groups, and supporting units. American forces provided extensive helicopter support, including transport helicopters and Cobra gunships from multiple aviation battalions. Air Force and Navy aircraft supplied tactical air support, while B-52 bombers conducted strikes on enemy positions. American artillery based in South Vietnam also fired into Laos in support of South Vietnamese units along Route 9 and surrounding fire bases. Early advances along Route 9 initially met little resistance as units moved toward their objectives and forward fire bases. But the North Vietnamese reacted quickly, deploying additional forces to confront the South Vietnamese in the incursion area. Reinforcements included the 304th, 308th, and 320th Divisions, and later the 2nd Division. By early March 1971, enemy troop strength in the area had risen to around 36,000, outnumbering South Vietnamese forces by approximately 2 to 1. The North Vietnamese employed tanks, including PT-76 light tanks and T-54 medium tanks, as well as extensive anti-aircraft defenses against the helicopter forces supporting the South Vietnamese advance. Forward fire bases manned by Ranger and airborne troops became focal points of enemy attacks. Fire Support Base 31, held by South Vietnamese airborne troops, was overrun by enemy forces in late February 1971, with many South Vietnamese taken prisoner. In response to mounting pressure and difficulties along Route 9, South Vietnamese commanders shifted to an air assault to seize Chepon instead of a continuous ground advance. On the 6th of March, 1971, approximately 120 American helicopters lifted 2 South Vietnamese battalions into the Chepon area. They entered with relatively light resistance and conducted limited search and destroy operations before beginning withdrawal due to increasing enemy pressure. The planned duration of the stay in Laos had envisioned South Vietnamese forces remaining until the onset of the rainy season. Instead, they withdrew earlier in March. South Vietnamese withdrawals from Laos beginning in mid-March often occurred under heavy enemy attacks on fire bases and along exfiltration routes. Because Route 9 could not be kept open, many units were extracted by helicopter rather than by ground movement. American helicopter units sustained significant losses supporting Lam Son 719. Reports indicate over 100 helicopters destroyed and hundreds more damaged. American aircrew casualties have been estimated at around 176 killed, nearly 2,000 wounded, and 42 missing. South Vietnamese casualties are estimated as roughly 50% of the committed force, with about 9,000 to 10,000 killed, wounded, or missing. North Vietnamese losses are more uncertain, though South Vietnamese and American sources claimed thousands of enemy killed. American summaries state that thousands of tons of enemy ammunition, fuel, and other supplies were destroyed during Lam Son 719. Despite these material losses, South Vietnamese forces failed to hold ground in Laos and ultimately withdrew under pressure. The operation exposed serious weaknesses in South Vietnamese leadership, coordination, and morale under sustained combat. North Vietnamese accounts portray Lam Son 719 as a major victory, emphasizing that they forced South Vietnamese forces out of Laos and inflicted heavy casualties. North Vietnamese leaders later cited the operation as demonstrating their ability to counter large South Vietnamese operations even when heavily supported by American air power. The outcome fueled debates in Washington over the pace of Vietnamization and the risks of further large offensives outside South Vietnam. Despite the operation's difficulties, the Nixon administration continued to present Lam Son 719 publicly as evidence that South Vietnamese forces could take on major combat roles with American support. But privately, the questions remained. Could Vietnamization succeed if the South Vietnamese army could not hold its own against a determined enemy? The test had been severe and the results were troubling. The images that emerged from Lam Son 719 told their own story. Photographs showed South Vietnamese soldiers clinging to the skids of helicopters, desperate to escape the battlefield. The pictures circulated widely and undermined the official narrative of progress. No amount of statistical claims about enemy supplies destroyed could erase the visual evidence of an army in retreat. For the soldiers who fought in Lam Son 719, the experience was one of intense combat against a well-prepared and numerically superior enemy. They had advanced into Laos with confidence, believing in their mission and their capabilities. They had established fire bases and pushed toward their objectives. But when the full weight of North Vietnamese counterattacks fell upon them, many units found themselves outmatched and outmaneuvered. The American advisors who could not accompany their South Vietnamese counterparts across the border watched with growing concern as reports came in. They had trained these units, worked alongside them, and believed in many of them. Now they could only provide air support and wait for the outcome. The outcome was not what they had hoped for. Lam Son 719 became the largest and most important test of South Vietnamese capability to conduct high-intensity operations under Vietnamization. The results were mixed at best. Material objectives were partially achieved, enemy supplies were disrupted, but the human cost was staggering, and the strategic picture that emerged was not one of a South Vietnamese military ready to stand on its own. The questions raised by Lam Son 719 would hang over Vietnamization for as long as the policy continued, and the enemy, bloodied but unbroken, began preparing for operations of their own. While the United States implemented Vietnamization and withdrew its forces, the other side was watching, adapting, and planning. The North Vietnamese leadership had suffered severe losses in the Tet Offensive and its aftermath. General Tran Van Tra later described 1969 and 1970 as difficult years for rebuilding forces in the South. The Viet Cong local forces had been heavily weakened, requiring greater use of North Vietnamese main force units in subsequent fighting. But the struggle continued, and Hanoi's strategists were determined to outlast their enemies. North Vietnamese strategy documents from this period continued to emphasize a protracted war approach while adapting to reduced direct contact with American ground forces as withdrawals began. As Vietnamization advanced, North Vietnamese planners increasingly focused on confronting the South Vietnamese army directly rather than primarily American ground units. The calculus had shifted. If American troops were leaving, the real enemy would soon be the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Despite American drawdowns, North Vietnam maintained or increased infiltration levels to replace losses and prepare for future large-scale offensives. Intelligence data show that about 66,000 men were infiltrated from North Vietnam to the southern war zones during the 1969 to 1970 dry season. During the 1970 to 1971 cycle, infiltration increased to roughly 106,000 men sent south. Between September 1971 and June 1972, about 136,000 infiltrators were dispatched towards South Vietnam, Cambodia, and southern Laos, surpassing previous cycles. The numbers were rising, not falling. Higher infiltration in 1970 to 1971 was partly driven by the need to reconstitute units damaged in the 1970 Cambodian Incursion. It also supported efforts to establish control over rice-producing areas and logistic corridors in the Cambodian countryside. North Vietnam expanded and upgraded its logistical system along the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia during 1969 to 1971 in response to American withdrawals and cross-border operations. Intelligence estimates indicated that by 1970, about 90% of supplies moving along the trail were being sent into South Vietnam's three northernmost provinces. This concentration in northern I Corps was interpreted as preparation for larger future operations in that sector. After the closure of Sihanoukville in March 1970, and Allied attacks in northeastern Cambodia, North Vietnam expanded overland routes through Laos to compensate for lost port access. Specialized transportation groups were created to manage the extended lines through Cambodia. Communist directives for the 1970 to 1971 campaign called for reinforcing each province in South Vietnam with an additional main force battalion. The directives emphasized simultaneous attacks on government-controlled population centers and on South Vietnamese and Allied field positions. Tactical guidance recommended attacking South Vietnamese forces whenever American ground support was absent or limited. The instructions reflected awareness of Vietnamization by stressing the need to target South Vietnamese units and disrupt pacification programs. Communist forces adjusted patterns of attack to exploit perceived weaknesses in the South Vietnamese army, including night operations and short, intense assaults on outposts. Intelligence reports described increased use of sapper units and mortars against headquarters, depots, and urban targets. Communist forces continued guerrilla activity in rural areas, but increasingly combined it with larger main force actions when conditions were favorable. Communist propaganda in the South portrayed Vietnamization as evidence that the United States was retreating and that the South Vietnamese army would eventually stand alone. Liberation Radio and leaflets criticized the South Vietnamese military as dependent on American support and urged soldiers to desert or defect. The political strategy included efforts to rebuild the political infrastructure that had been damaged during the Tet Offensive and Allied pacification operations. Cadres were directed to exploit discontent over bombing, refugee movements, and corruption within the Saigon regime. North Vietnamese internal assessments recognized that the South Vietnamese army had improved in some respects but continued to identify weaknesses in leadership and cohesion. Captured documents and post-war Vietnamese histories note that North Vietnamese planners expected South Vietnamese forces to be more vulnerable once American ground forces withdrew. Training during this period increasingly emphasized anti-armor tactics and night assaults to counter South Vietnamese mechanized formations. North Vietnam upgraded its anti-aircraft defenses, deploying more heavy machine guns and radar-guided systems to offset American and South Vietnamese air support. The leadership also intensified political indoctrination to maintain morale during prolonged fighting under heavy air pressure. Vietnamese sources describe 1969 to 1970 as a period of strategic recovery, in which forces rebalanced after Tet while waiting for favorable conditions to launch bigger offensives. North Vietnamese planners monitored American troop withdrawal announcements closely, viewing them as signals of diminishing American willingness to sustain high casualties. Early infiltration arrivals were deployed to strengthen units in Cambodia before being sent into South Vietnam's 3rd and 4th military regions. Later groups were used as replacements for losses incurred during subsequent offensives. Communist manpower strategy included using newly infiltrated troops to support operations in the 3rd Corps tactical zone. Forces were also strengthened opposite the 1st Corps, using infiltration through Laos to mass units in Quang Tri and Thu Thien provinces. By 1971, intelligence was reporting heavy infiltration from Laos and across the demilitarized zone into Quang Tri. The buildup was unmistakable. North Vietnamese propaganda for domestic audiences presented Vietnamization as proof that the United States was being forced to Vietnamize its defeat, reinforcing commitment to continue the struggle. North Vietnamese leaders interpreted the 1970 Cambodian incursion as significant, but believed they could compensate by spreading sanctuaries deeper into Cambodia and Laos. Operations in Cambodia during 1970 to 1971 aimed both to support Khmer Rouge allies and to secure new logistical depth against future Allied offensives. By late 1970, American analysts anticipated that Hanoi would likely launch a major offensive in 1971 or 1972 to disrupt Vietnamization. Nixon administration documents from November 1970 note American expectations of a large North Vietnamese offensive, prompting planning for operations like Lam Son 719. Vietnamese scholarship describes preparations for a major offensive designed to challenge the South Vietnamese army after a period of American withdrawals. North Vietnamese planners used increased artillery, armor, and coordinated multi-division operations to test South Vietnamese capacity without American ground forces. North Vietnam also intensified efforts to attack pacification targets, challenging government control in the countryside. Communist directives called for coordinated attacks against population centers while maintaining pressure on field forces. Low-level attacks using mortars, sappers, and mines continued to impose costs even as overall American ground presence declined. Information campaigns portrayed South Vietnamese reliance on American air power as a sign of structural weakness. By the end of 1971, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces had adapted to many aspects of Vietnamization. They maintained or increased infiltration, shifted emphasis to main force units, and prepared for larger conventional offensives against an increasingly exposed South Vietnamese army. The enemy was waiting for the right moment. And when that moment came, they intended to strike with everything they had. The contrast between the two sides was stark. The United States was withdrawing, eager to end its involvement. The costs had become too high, the domestic opposition too strong. Nixon hoped that Vietnamization would buy time, that South Vietnamese forces would grow strong enough. These were hopes, not certainties. On the other side, North Vietnam showed no such ambivalence. The leadership in Hanoi remained committed to reunification under communist rule, as it had been since the beginning. They had fought the French, they had fought the Americans, they would fight the South Vietnamese. However long it took, however many casualties they suffered, they would continue. This asymmetry of will was the most fundamental factor in the war. The infiltration figures told the story. While American troop numbers declined from over 500,000 to under 200,000, North Vietnamese infiltration increased. The pipeline down the Ho Chi Minh Trail kept flowing, bringing men and materiel to the battlefields. Every American withdrawal was met with another cohort of Northern soldiers heading south. The years 1969 to 1971 were years of preparation for what was to come. The great offensive that Hanoi's planners envisioned would test Vietnamization as never before. The months of infiltration and training, of rebuilding and repositioning, would culminate in a storm of fire. But that story belonged to another chapter. For now, the forces gathered, the plans took shape, and the war continued toward a climax few could foresee. While American troops withdrew and South Vietnamese forces expanded, life in North Vietnam continued under the weight of war and the structures of a mobilized socialist state. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam maintained a nationwide food rationing system throughout the years from 1969 to 1971, allocating grain and root crops according to work category, age, and location. This system had its origins in 1954, and by the late 1960s, it remained the principal mechanism for distributing staple foods to urban residents and many in the countryside as well. Rice, maize, manioc, and sweet potatoes formed the core of what the state provided, though the amounts varied depending on the labor one performed. The rationing categories differentiated between heavy laborers, ordinary workers, office staff, and dependents, with those engaged in physically demanding work receiving larger grain allocations. Shortages of consumer goods extended well beyond food. Clothing, footwear, and household items were difficult to obtain, leading families to repair and reuse whatever they had, and to barter among themselves to extend the life of worn possessions. The wartime command economy prioritized resources for military and strategic needs, leaving civilian consumption to make do with what remained. The government mobilized labor through state plans that assigned work quotas across agriculture, industry, construction, and transport. Cooperative agriculture remained the dominant structure in rural areas, with production teams responsible for meeting state procurement targets while also feeding local populations. Women formed a substantial proportion of the rural labor force during these years, as large numbers of men served in the army or worked on transport routes that stretched toward the southern battlefields. The leadership promoted a slogan that captured the dual burden of the times: fighting while producing. This phrase described the simultaneous demands of military struggle and economic work that shaped daily existence. Industrial production concentrated on basic goods, military supplies, and repair facilities. Many factories and workshops had been dispersed or camouflaged to reduce their vulnerability to air attack, a precaution that had become second nature after years of bombing. Urban residents commonly supplemented state rations with food from small private plots, gardens, and whatever local markets could provide. Electricity in cities such as Hanoi and Haiphong remained intermittent, disrupted by bombing damage and fuel shortages that led to frequent outages and careful rationing of power. Civil defense was woven into the fabric of daily life, especially in the major cities that remained under the threat of American air operations. Hanoi and other urban centers maintained extensive networks of bomb shelters, including trench systems, covered slit trenches, and reinforced basements beneath public buildings. Many families built small shelters in their courtyards or near their dwellings, while public shelters lined streets and stood ready near workplaces. Air raid drills were conducted routinely in schools, factories, and neighborhoods. Children learned to recognize air raid signals and practiced moving quickly to shelters as part of their school training in civil defense. The government distributed basic materials such as shovels, picks, and sandbags to work units and neighborhood groups, ensuring that everyone could contribute to protection and repair. Education continued to function despite the conditions of war. Many schools had been relocated to rural areas or operated in shifts to reduce the concentration of students in vulnerable locations. School curricula combined standard academic subjects with political education that stressed socialist values, anti-imperialist themes, and unwavering support for the war effort. Youth and student groups were encouraged to volunteer for agricultural work, road repair, and logistical support tasks during their school breaks. The Ho Chi Minh Communist Youth Union organized campaigns for young people to serve as shock brigades on transport routes and construction projects, channeling their energy into the national struggle. The Vietnam Women's Union mobilized women into production, civil defense, and support roles that included caring for the wounded and supporting the families of soldiers at the front. Trade unions and mass organizations were integrated into the planning system, helping to implement production targets and political campaigns at the workplace level. The Workers' Party of Vietnam maintained a dense network of party cells in factories, cooperatives, and administrative bodies, directing and monitoring the implementation of policies from the center down to the smallest unit of society. Propaganda surrounded the population at every turn. Posters, radio broadcasts, and newspapers continually highlighted themes of national unity, sacrifice, and the certainty of eventual victory. Radio Hanoi served as a major channel for news, political messages, and cultural programming, reaching both urban and rural audiences across the country. Wartime cultural work included songs, poetry, theater, and art exhibits designed to sustain morale and celebrate the contributions of fighters and workers alike. State media praised exemplary workers and production units that exceeded their quotas, holding them up as models for emulation campaigns that encouraged others to match their achievements. The regime also encouraged small-scale innovations in production, such as improved tools or new work methods, as ways to increase output with the limited resources available. Economic and military aid continued to flow from the Soviet Union, China, and other socialist countries, helping to offset domestic shortages that might otherwise have become unbearable. Aid deliveries included food, fuel, machinery, vehicles, and construction materials, often shipped through Chinese and Laotian routes that wound their way toward the north. Urban housing in cities like Hanoi remained crowded, with multiple families sometimes sharing communal courtyards, kitchens, and washing facilities. Many city residents had evacuated children and elderly relatives to rural areas during periods of intense bombing, creating dispersed family arrangements that separated loved ones for months or even years at a time. Local militia units organized in neighborhoods and villages provided local defense and assistance with civil defense tasks. These units conducted patrols, manned observation posts, and helped clear debris after air raids struck their communities. Political study sessions and meetings for criticism and self-criticism reinforced discipline and ideological conformity in workplaces and cooperatives. Land transport within North Vietnam relied heavily on bicycles, animal-drawn carts, and a limited number of motor vehicles, as fuel remained scarce and many roads bore the scars of bombing. Railway lines and bridges were frequent targets of air attack, and repairs and improvised bypasses became a regular part of civil engineering work. The state maintained strict control over internal migration and residence registration, managing labor allocation and ration distribution through a system of permits and documentation. Citizens were required to present ration cards and identity documents to receive food and goods from state distribution centers. Despite the shortages, authorities worked to maintain basic health services with clinics and mobile medical teams operating under wartime constraints. Vaccination and public health campaigns continued, often coordinated through mass organizations and workplace health committees. Letters from soldiers at the front were sometimes read aloud in collective settings, linking civilians with frontline units and reinforcing the sense of shared purpose that the government worked so hard to cultivate. Families of fallen or serving soldiers received some state support, including priority in rations or access to certain services, administered through local committees that tracked the contributions and sacrifices of each household. The state's control extended to the most basic aspects of movement and identity. Citizens carried documents that recorded their residence registration, their work assignments, and their entitlements. To move from one place to another required permission, and to receive one's ration required presenting the proper papers at the proper distribution point. This system allowed the government to manage the allocation of scarce resources while maintaining surveillance over a population engaged in total war. The psychological burden of years of war showed in small ways that propaganda could not entirely conceal. Families separated by evacuation or military service maintained connection through letters that traveled slowly along routes disrupted by bombing. The reading of soldiers' letters in collective settings served multiple purposes. It reinforced the link between those who fought and those who waited. It reminded everyone of the stakes involved, and it allowed the state to shape the narrative of sacrifice and perseverance that sustained the war effort. Daily life in North Vietnam between 1969 and 1971 combined rationed living conditions with extensive mobilization and civil defense measures that reached into every corner of society. The structures of the socialist state shaped how people worked, ate, and thought about the war that continued to demand everything they had to give. In this world of shortages, ordinary people endured because they had no alternative, and because the state provided just enough to keep body and spirit together while the war ground on. Across the demilitarized zone in South Vietnam, life followed different rhythms, shaped by a different kind of war economy and a society caught between multiple pressures. Economic studies of the period record that 1969 to 1971 saw substantial recovery and growth in both agriculture and industry compared with the years of heaviest fighting. South Vietnam's economic expansion was aided by relatively favorable rice harvests and by the continued inflow of American economic and military aid that kept the wheels of commerce turning. Yet this growth carried within it the seeds of disruption. For as American troops began their withdrawal, the nature of the economy began to shift in ways that would prove difficult to manage. The American troop withdrawals after 1969 reduced direct American spending in South Vietnam, and this reduction rippled through businesses and workers who had tied their fortunes to the presence of United States bases. The economies that had grown up around those bases, supplying goods and services to American personnel, began to contract as units redeployed and spending declined. American military expenditures had created a highly paid minority around the bases and generated abnormal profits for some urban businesses, but this prosperity was always borrowed from the circumstances of war. As direct spending decreased, the South Vietnamese government sought to enlarge its own tax revenues and encourage local production to sustain economic activity independent of American largesse. Economic reforms in 1970 and 1971 included adjustments to exchange rates and measures affecting currency conversions linked to American spending patterns. Despite the dislocations caused by war, South Vietnam retained a relatively large services sector centered in Saigon and other cities. Saigon remained the primary commercial center, its markets busy with buyers and sellers, its shops stocked with goods both local and imported, its cafes and entertainment venues serving a population that found ways to live amid uncertainty. The presence of remaining American personnel and foreign diplomatic missions sustained employment in transportation, hospitality, and retail, even as the overall American footprint shrank. Urbanization continued during this period, as rural insecurity and economic opportunities drew migrants into Saigon and other major towns. Millions of South Vietnamese peasants had been internally displaced by the fighting, moving to government-controlled refugee camps or settling in the crowded margins of urban areas. Many of these new arrivals lived in informal settlements or cramped rental housing, creating strains on infrastructure and services that the government struggled to address. Clean water, sanitation, and adequate shelter became pressing concerns in neighborhoods that had grown faster than any planning could anticipate. Pacification and population security became increasingly central to South Vietnamese policy as Vietnamization proceeded. The government invested in programs designed to extend its presence into rural areas, building schools, clinics, and roads in districts that had long been contested. The Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support Structure coordinated these efforts, linking military operations with development projects intended to win the allegiance of villagers who had experienced years of violence and uncertainty. In some provinces, improved security allowed a limited revival of rural markets and seasonal fairs, small signs of normalcy returning to communities that had known little peace. In the cities, security measures remained a constant presence. Checkpoints controlled movement on major roads, identification checks occurred at government buildings and public facilities, and curfews regulated life after dark. A report from Saigon in May 1970 described the curfew being tightened to run from 11 at night until 5:30 in the morning, a response to concerns about infiltration and unrest. Authorities linked these stricter measures to fears of Viet Cong subversion, and schools were sometimes closed temporarily when demonstrations or security threats emerged. The Capital Military District Command issued regulations governing movement in Saigon, Cholan, and the surrounding province, creating a framework of control that shaped daily routines for millions. Urban policing focused on protecting government buildings, bridges, markets, and transport hubs against the attacks and sabotage that remained constant threats. In many rural areas, villagers followed security routines such as avoiding travel at night and cooperating with regional and popular forces for local defense. Fear of night attacks led officials and civilians in some provinces to sleep inside towns rather than in isolated hamlets that offered easier targets for guerrilla operations. The line between secure and contested territory often depended on the time of day and the presence of armed forces willing and able to defend a given location. South Vietnamese media and official messaging emphasized progress in pacification and the growing capability of the armed forces under Vietnamization. Government broadcasts and newspapers highlighted military operations and portrayed American withdrawals as evidence of increasing self-reliance rather than as abandonment. President Nguyen Van Thie's administration presented Vietnamization domestically as a transition towards self-defense, a maturation of the nation rather than a retreat of its protectors. Public ceremonies and parades showcased army units and territorial forces, aiming to bolster confidence that the country could defend itself against the communist threat. Anti-communist themes remained prominent in government propaganda. Education in government-controlled areas continued under a system influenced by French and American models. University students in Saigon and Hue participated in political debates and occasionally in protests concerning the war. Schools were sometimes closed by government order in response to demonstrations, reflecting the tension between maintaining order and allowing civil society to function. Religious institutions, including the Catholic Church and Buddhist organizations, remained important social forces. In many urban households, daily routines combined wage labor or small business activities with the management of extended families and the constant struggle against inflation. Inflation was a persistent problem, driven by wartime spending, currency expansion, and dependence on imports. Government salary earners, including civil servants and soldiers' families, were particularly affected by rising costs. Black markets and informal currency exchanges flourished. Public transport continued to operate, though subject to curfews and occasional disruption. Street vendors and small shops provided food and everyday goods at prices reflecting supply conditions. The overall security focus in South Vietnam gradually shifted from large American-led operations to patrols, checkpoints, and local defense conducted by South Vietnamese forces. American troop withdrawals reduced the number of advisors present at lower levels, increasing the direct responsibility shouldered by Vietnamese officers. Government messaging sought to reassure the population that growing capabilities would compensate for the declining American presence. Daily life in many areas combined elements of normal routines with persistent wartime practices, curfews and checkpoints coexisting with markets and schooling. Assessments from this period describe South Vietnam as experiencing both economic improvement and continuing insecurity, with conditions varying significantly by region and by the fortunes of local commanders and local enemies, locked in struggle. Information campaigns used radio, posters, and pamphlets to encourage rural populations to cooperate with pacification programs and report Viet Cong activities. Leaflets and loudspeaker broadcasts conveyed government messages about elections, land reform, and the benefits of security. Successive land reform initiatives sought to redistribute land and reduce rural grievances, though implementation varied by region. These programs aimed to address the discontent that had fueled support for the communist insurgency. Entertainment venues, including cinemas, bars, and clubs, remained part of Saigon's urban life, serving both Vietnamese patrons and the diminishing foreign population. The rhythms of the city continued despite the war, with commerce finding ways to persist in the spaces between violence. The refugee settlements on the city's margins told a different story, one of displacement and hardship, but even there, people built lives among those who shared their experience. The government's refugee programs provided basic services when resources allowed, though the scale of displacement often exceeded capacity to respond. Camps stretched across the country, housing families who had fled fighting and now waited for a peace that remained elusive. For many, the war had become a permanent condition, shaping every decision and hope. By the end of 1971, South Vietnam presented contrasts and contradictions. Economic indicators showed improvement even as the social fabric strained. Cities bustled while rural areas remained contested. The withdrawal of American forces proceeded while questions about whether the South Vietnamese military could stand alone remained unanswered. In this landscape, ordinary people navigated the challenges of daily life, finding ways to work, trade, raise families, and survive another day in a war showing no signs of ending. In the United States, public debate over Vietnam during the years from 1969 to 1971 featured both growing anti-war activism and continued support among those who favored a strong stance against communism. The country found itself divided not only along political lines but within families and communities as the war raised questions that touched on patriotism, morality, and the proper limits of American power. Anti-war protests during this period took place in all major American cities and on hundreds of college campuses, creating a visible and often contentious presence that shaped the national conversation. On the 15th of October 1969, The first Vietnam moratorium to end the war drew hundreds of thousands of Americans into demonstrations across the nation. Estimates for participation in that single-day range up to 15 million people taking part in some form of anti-war action, from work stoppages and teach-ins to vigils and marches organized by the Vietnam Moratorium Committee. The scale of participation reflected the depth of opposition that had built over years of escalating conflict and mounting casualties. A second major moratorium event followed on the 15th of November 1969, centered on a mass march and rally in Washington. That demonstration drew more than 500,000 participants, making it one of the largest anti-war gatherings in American history. The November actions included a march against death in which participants walked past the White House, reading aloud the names of American and Vietnamese war dead, a solemn procession that gave individual identity to the statistics of loss. President Nixon responded to the first moratorium with his November 3rd address, the speech in which he appealed to the silent majority of Americans who, he argued, supported his Vietnam policy even if they did not take to the streets. In that address, Nixon asked for public backing as he pursued Vietnamization and negotiations rather than immediate withdrawal. Public opinion polling in late 1969 showed a divided nation, with increasing percentages viewing the war as a mistake but disagreeing on how quickly American forces should leave. The moratorium events drew support from clergy, students, trade unionists, and some elected officials, illustrating the broad social base of opposition that crossed lines of class and generation. At the same time, pro-administration rallies and symbols such as flag displays and Support Our Troops campaigns were organized by Americans who backed the war effort. On the 15th of October 1969, some Americans opposed to the moratorium followed calls to keep their lights on or drive with headlights lit during the day to signal their support for Nixon and his policies. Senator Edward Kennedy used the October moratorium to reiterate his call in the Senate for a phased American withdrawal no later than 1972. Republican Senator Barry Goldwater criticized the protesters, claiming they were playing into the hands of the enemy by demonstrating dissent. The organized student anti-war movement included groups such as Students for a Democratic Society, which had been active since the mid-1960s in organizing campus opposition. University mapping of protests identifies nearly 900 American campuses with anti-war demonstrations in May 1970 alone, a measure of how deeply the war had penetrated student life. Nixon's announcement of the Cambodian Incursion on the 30th of April 1970 triggered a renewed wave of protests across the country. In early May, student strikes against the Cambodian operation and the war more broadly led to the temporary closure of hundreds of colleges and universities. Some observers have called the May 1970 student strikes the largest episode of student protest in American history. On the 4th of May 1970, National Guard troops fired on demonstrators at Kent State University in Ohio, killing 4 students and wounding others in a confrontation that shocked the nation. 11 days later, police in Jackson, Mississippi, shot and killed 2 students during protests at Jackson State College. The shootings at Kent State and Jackson State intensified opposition to the war and raised urgent questions about the domestic use of force against American citizens exercising their right to protest. A week after Kent State, approximately 100,000 demonstrators rallied in Washington in a large anti-war protest that drew participants from across the country. Vietnam-era anti-war protests also took place in smaller cities and towns, including local marches, vigils, and sit-ins at draft boards. The movement included faith-based organizations such as clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam, and many mainline Protestant and Catholic leaders added their voices to the call for peace. Veterans played a visible role, with groups such as Vietnam Veterans Against the War organizing demonstrations and providing testimony before Congress. Opposition to the war in Congress increased between 1969 and 1971, with more legislators introducing or supporting restrictions on war funding or troop deployments. The Cooper Church Amendment, introduced in 1970 by Senators John Sherman Cooper and Frank Church, sought to cut off funds for maintaining American troops in Cambodia. The original version also aimed to bar support for South Vietnamese operations outside South Vietnam and restrict American air activities in Cambodia. After extended debate, a revised Cooper Church Amendment was enacted on the 5th of January, 1971, prohibiting the reintroduction of American ground forces into Cambodia. Congressional researchers note that Cooper Church marked the first time Congress formally restricted combat operations during the Vietnam War over presidential objections. Other legislative proposals between 1969 and 1971 sought to repeal or limit the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which had provided the legal authorization for broad use of force in Southeast Asia. In June 1970, Congress repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, reducing the formal legal basis for open-ended military engagement. Hawks in Congress argued for continuing strong military pressure to secure acceptable peace terms, warning that legislative limits would embolden Hanoi. Doves emphasized the human and financial costs of the war and argued that continued fighting was unlikely to produce decisive gains. Public opinion polls during 1969 to 1971 consistently showed majorities wanting either reduced involvement or withdrawal, though opinions differed on the timing and conditions. By 1971, a majority of Americans regarded involvement in Vietnam as a mistake. Nixon and his advisors hoped that troop withdrawals and Vietnamization would gradually diminish the intensity of the anti-war movement. However, the Cambodian Incursion and the Kent State tragedy demonstrated that certain decisions could rapidly reignite large-scale protests despite ongoing withdrawal announcements. Media coverage of protests, including images of clashes and marches, kept Vietnam-related debate highly visible. By late 1971, anti-war demonstrations continued, though some noted a shift toward smaller, more fragmented actions compared with the peak of the 1969 moratorium. The years from 1969 to 1971 saw large national protests, campus mobilization, and significant congressional debate, all contributing to pressure for continued troop withdrawals and constraints on expanding the war into new territories. The anti-war movement drew on multiple traditions of dissent. Some protesters came from pacifist backgrounds motivated by religious or moral objections to violence. Others were more pragmatic, convinced that the war was unwinnable or that its costs exceeded any conceivable benefit. Students formed the most visible contingent, their energy giving the movement a particular character. Faculty organized teach-ins and drafted petitions, lending academic authority to the cause. The tension between demonstrators and war supporters sometimes erupted into confrontation. Counter-protesters appeared at anti-war events, and debates strained relationships within families. Construction workers in New York attacked anti-war protesters in the Hard Hat Riot. The Nixon administration cultivated the image of a silent majority that rejected the protest movement, positioning demonstrators as a vocal minority. Congressional debate involved fundamental issues of constitutional authority. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution had been passed in 1964 with near unanimous support, But by the decade's end, legislators questioned whether that authorization still applied. The repeal of the resolution and measures like Cooper Church represented congressional efforts to reassert its role in decisions about war and peace. The media played a crucial role in shaping public perception. Television brought images of combat and demonstrations into American living rooms. Journalists who questioned official accounts found themselves in tension with an administration that saw critical coverage as undermining the war effort. Throughout this period, the human cost continued to mount. Young men faced military service through a draft system many saw as unfair. Families received news of casualties and waited anxiously for letters from loved ones. The anti-war movement achieved significant political results even as it failed to end the war immediately. Troop withdrawals proceeded, and congressional restrictions limited expansion. Public opposition created a context in which high casualty levels became untenable, pushing administrations toward alternatives promising to bring troops home. As the calendar turned toward the end of 1971, the military landscape in Vietnam had been transformed by years of Vietnamization and American withdrawal. On the 31st of December 1971, United States troop strength in South Vietnam stood at about 156,800 personnel, a dramatic reduction from the peak of more than 540,000 just 2.5 years earlier. American forces in South Vietnam were now largely concentrated in air, logistics, advisory, and some remaining combat units, with the Army of the Republic of Vietnam bearing most ground combat duties. Allied troop tables listed South Vietnamese armed forces at approximately 1,046,250 personnel in 1971, including ARVN and other branches of service. The force structure included 11 ARVN infantry divisions plus airborne, Marine, Ranger, Armor, and territorial units spread across the country. Territorial, regional, and popular forces totaled several 100,000 personnel responsible for local security in villages and hamlets. American assessments described ARVN as responsible for most ground operations, with United States units shifted to support and security roles that no longer put American soldiers at the leading edge of combat. The Communist forces maintained substantial strength despite the losses and disruptions of previous years. Net assessments estimated that by late 1970, the Viet Cong and PAVN had approximately 237,000 troops in and around South Vietnam. By 1971, many Viet Cong local units had been incorporated into PAVN command structures, blurring the distinctions between Southern guerrillas and Northern regulars. Infiltration data showed that during the 1970 to 1971 cycle, about 106,000 personnel were dispatched from North Vietnam toward the Southern Theater. Between September 1971 and June 1972, approximately 136,000 more infiltrators were sent south. PAVN main force units had been reinforced in Quang Tri and Thua Thien provinces opposite I Corps, and extensive logistical infrastructure remained along the Ho Chi Minh Trail network through Laos and Cambodia. American air power continued to play a significant role, with tactical aircraft and B-52s flying strikes in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia to interdict supply routes and support ARVN operations. Strategic bombing of North Vietnam remained restricted under limits imposed during the Johnson administration, though that restraint would not last. By the end of 1971, ARVN divisions were deployed across 4 core tactical zones, from I Corps in the north to IV Corps in the Mekong Delta. American advisors at division and regimental levels continued to support ARVN planning, logistics, and fire support coordination. Some assessments noted that the South Vietnamese were not improving as fast as the United States forces were withdrawing, a gap that raised questions about what would happen when American support declined further. Military analyses generally concluded that ARVN could hold against current levels of communist activity with continued American air and logistical backing, but warned that a major multi-division PAVN offensive could severely test ARVN capabilities. In April 1971, Nixon announced that Vietnamization had succeeded and declared a further withdrawal of 100,000 American troops between May and November of that year. American planners cited declining casualty figures and ARVN's increased operational role as indicators supporting continued troop reductions. At the political level, President Nguyen Van Thieu remained firmly in power in Saigon, having won re-election in a contested presidential election in October 1971. The election was boycotted by major opposition candidates, resulting in Thieu running effectively unopposed. American observers noted that his re-election consolidated executive power but raised questions about political pluralism in South Vietnam. In North Vietnam, the Workers' Party maintained centralized control, portraying Vietnamization and American withdrawals as signs of American weakness. Official narratives stressed that the revolution was entering a phase favorable to continued struggle. Paris, peace talks continued through 1971 with limited progress as both sides maintained publicly firm positions on key issues such as political settlement and troop withdrawals. Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese Representative Le Duc Tho held secret talks in Paris during 1971, exploring proposals for ceasefire and political arrangements that had yet to produce agreement. American domestic opinion by 1971 showed large majorities favoring withdrawal of all troops from Indochina within a relatively short time. One poll reported that by April 1971, 73% of Americans favored withdrawing all troops by the end of that year. Most Americans considered sending troops to Vietnam a mistake. Within Congress, support grew for legislative constraints on expanding the war, and Cooper Church-type restrictions influenced planning by limiting options for new large-scale ground operations outside South Vietnam. Military analyses highlighted the continued importance of American air and logistics support as ARVN's principal external advantage. They also recognized that ARVN leadership, training, and maintenance systems still had significant weaknesses despite numerical growth. Communist strategy documents, as interpreted by American intelligence, suggested that Hanoi sought to husband forces in 1971 while preparing for more ambitious operations. Infiltration levels in late 1971 were assessed as higher than in previous years, indicating ongoing force buildup rather than de-escalation. On the ground in South Vietnam, many areas remained contested. Government-controlled cities and main roads coexisted with PAVN and Viet Cong influence in parts of the countryside and border regions. Maps typically showed secure zones around major urban centers and along certain highways with various ratings of security in rural districts. Pacification statistics recorded increases in the number of hamlets rated as secure or relatively secure, though some analysts cautioned that these metrics could overstate government control. Nixon administration statements in late 1971 presented Vietnamization as proceeding successfully and emphasized that American forces were coming home. Internal Pentagon and military documents acknowledged that the reduced American ground presence could encourage Hanoi to attempt larger offensives. By December 1971, the overall balance of forces featured a numerically large but variably trained ARVN, a reduced but still powerful American air and logistics presence, and significant PAVN and Viet Cong main force units positioned in and around South Vietnam. The stage was being set for the tests that would come in the following year when North Vietnam would launch its largest offensive since Tet, and the question of whether Vietnamization had truly succeeded would be answered not in policy documents but on battlefields across the country. The years from 1969 to 1971 had witnessed a fundamental transformation in how the war was being fought. American combat forces that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands had been reduced to a fraction of their former strength. South Vietnamese forces had expanded dramatically, taking on responsibilities that Americans had previously shouldered. The policy of Vietnamization had moved from concept to implementation, from speeches and memoranda to the daily reality of ARVN soldiers patrolling jungles and villages where American units had once operated. Yet questions remained about whether this transformation represented genuine strength or merely the appearance of progress. American advisors and analysts noted both improvements and persistent weaknesses. Some units performed well in combat, demonstrating leadership and tactical skill that justified the investment in training and equipment. Others struggled with the same problems that had plagued them for years: poor leadership, corruption, low morale, and excessive casualties among their best officers. The uneven quality of ARVN meant that assessments of Vietnamization's success depended heavily on which units and regions were being evaluated. The communist side had adapted as well. The heavy losses suffered during and after Tet had forced rebuilding. PAVN took on a larger share of the fighting as local Viet Cong forces declined. The logistical system along the Ho Chi Minh Trail had been expanded. Infiltration continued at substantial levels, ensuring replacement troops reached the south despite American bombing. The political landscape had evolved. In South Vietnam, President Thieu had consolidated power. In the United States, public opinion had shifted decisively against continued involvement. The Paris peace talks had ground on without breakthrough. Secret channels operated alongside public negotiations, with Kissinger and Le Duc Tho probing for positions that might form the basis for agreement. As 1971 drew to a close, the war showed no sign of ending. American forces continued their withdrawal, Vietnamese forces on both sides continued their struggle, and the people caught between them continued to endure. The questions raised by Vietnamization awaited answers that only time and battle would provide. Rest now and let the story settle into memory. The journey continues, but for now, let sleep come gently, and let the mind find peace in the quiet space between one chapter and the next.